Mrs. Betty Friedan is the founding father of the women's liberation movement, whose book, The Feminine Mystique, is considered the charter document and continues 7 years after its publication to outsell all the other books addressed to the same theme. Mrs. Friedan is not liked by everyone who likes her movement, which is, of course, true about everybody. Miss Tanya Grossinger, for instance, who was the publicist for The Feminine Mystique when it first appeared, said, however, now I see her on television and shudder at this all-knowing monster I created. It is said by some of her critics that she doesn't give the other side a chance to express itself, but I prefer to believe that that is a male chauvinist plot to discredit her, who says merely about herself that she is a woman who is passionate, fanatic, and crusading. I'd rather be hot than wrong, rather be committed than detached. Mrs. Friedan was born and raised in Peoria, Illinois, and her academic brilliance was soon spotted, as also her refusal to accept institutional arrangements merely because they were institutional arrangements. She went then to Smith College, where she graduated first in her class, obtaining higher honors than had ever been given to any student there, and serving also as editor of the student newspaper, which became the pulpit for her searing indictments of things as they were. Although in her subsequent career as writer, freelancer, polemicist, she more or less founded Women's Lib, there are those who now think of her as the movement's NAACP, a subject which will no doubt arise. I'd like to begin by asking Mrs. Friedan to comment on an observation of Sally Kempton, also of the movement, who said of her, she misrepresents the case for feminism by making people believe that reform is the answer. The problem is more fundamental. The entire society has to be upended. Is that so?
Well, upended, you know. I mean, that strikes me as meaningless rhetoric. I think that that this unfinished revolution, you know, of women toward full equality with men and their own identity and human freedom and all the rest, is going to radically restructure society. I mean, it can't be done by sort of little patchwork or by tokenism, but but I'm real and serious about it. It's not a question of rhetoric as far as I'm concerned. I think we honestly do have the political power to restructure the institutions. I mean, to say you're going to overthrow society is meaningless for any revolution. What you're going to do is restructure it. And full equality for women means restructuring of all kinds of institutions, from the very, you know, hours of work, from all the, every profession, industry, higher education. All our institutions are really structured today as man's world, and women walk in them as freaks or just simply do the menial housework in them. If you're going to have real equality for women and participation by women in society, then there will be radical restructuring of the family and even of architecture and home. And finally, if you really confront the full implications of equality for women, there's going to be a new theology and a new politics and a new art. But this is radical. This isn't reformism. This is radical change. There's a pseudo-radical rhetoric that I think perhaps some of the people in the movement that are still wallowing in the problem, if you will, you know, so obsessed with the rage that's understandable, that's caused by the conditions, that they don't get beyond it to see that we do have the power to make changes, that this is not going to be done with a bedroom war, but it's going to be done by serious political action, even though it's not what anyone else has defined as political. And I believe that this is radical, and I don't believe that man is the enemy of this. I think that man will be liberated by this. And as evidence of that, you see more and more men joining our movement, supporting our movement. When I go to speak now at a university in what you call Middle America or in Georgetown or wherever it is, there are more and more men in the audience, and they seem to feel that their liberation is entailed. After all, why should men die 10 years younger than women, you see? And why should they have to live up to some stupid machismo that's obsolete when, you know, there are no bears to kill? So, you know, to make every man say masculinity, the masculine mystique, you know, bear killing big muscle, Ernest Hemingway, would make every man to begin with feel so inadequate that then he has to defend himself, and you've got, you know, 10 strikes against him before he begins. And this is almost as bad for man as the feminine mystique was in making women suppress their strength or never even finding it in participation in society.
Well, you said a lot. He said a lot, because it could be that the men who come to listen to your lectures are there in the same spirit that the court would go to the early Jacobinical councils.
No, don't think so.
Well, but you said so much which is so interesting that, if I may, I'll ask you a few questions about the things as they came up. When you say a menial work, what is it that makes it menial to, say, wash dishes and makes it not menial to, say, pour milk into bottles in a factory?
Well, no, it isn't that. It's that today it isn't a question of whether women are going to work in the home or outside the home. Mm-hmm. The majority of women today work outside the home, and the great majority will work outside the home for a preponderant number of years of their adult life for a great many reasons, mostly because the basic work of society is now done beyond the confines of the individual kitchen, bedroom, and the cow doesn't graze on the yard of the ranch house, you know, and the steak is bought at the supermarket, and it costs money, and women, like everyone else, have to, you know, earn money to eat, and in most families today, two incomes are necessary, even if the family is intact, and half of all marriages end in divorce, and many women have to work as sole supporters of themselves and children. But even when women are living at home, in marriages that are intact, and when the husband is working, the income is often necessary. Furthermore, women have so many more years of adult life beyond the childbearing years that they almost have to participate in society by working, even to use their energies. But the question is where they're working, and they are doing the menial work, whether it's this studio or whether, you know, in other words, so you do know that there's a difference between the janitor that you know, runs the mop to clean up the studio at night and the work that you do. Mm-hmm. And while there should be dignity in the work of every human being, any spirited boy with the chance and with the education would perhaps more aspire to your work than to the work of the janitor. Mm-hmm. But women are doing the janitress work in industry.
So therefore, when you use menial, you weren't referring exclusively to housework.
No, women are doing the housework of industry, you see. They are doing the menial work, no matter what. The statistics show this. The average wage of women who work outside the home is about half that of men. A woman with a college education makes somewhere between what a man with an 8th grade to a man with high school education makes. And this is true all the way down the line. You find 3 out of 4 women who work today in the menial, secretarial, filing clerk, hospital aide, you know, very, very assembly line kind of job, and you find a token 1, 2, 3% in the work that either is decision-making in society or that has a rewarding pay. And this is also true in politics, where the women are looking at the zip codes, but we have 1 woman out of 100 in the Senate for 55% of the voting population. And it's true in the church, where they're cooking the church suppers and making rag dolls out of dishcloths to sell to one another, and they are not preaching the sermons, you know, they don't have the voice that every human being has a right to have.
Yeah. On the other hand, to deduce, as I think you do implicitly from that women are either victimized or unhappier, does not necessarily follow, because, as has been pointed out, I suppose this is to wave a red flag in front of you, but it has in fact been pointed out that the majority of women who stay at home exercise more responsibility than the majority of men who go to work. Could it therefore be that a woman who is in charge of her household exercises responsibilities that give her a sense of gratification that is in fact not reached by most men, and that under the circumstances she doesn't need to feel that half of the senators or the congressmen have to be women?
No, but you see, there are many complex overtones to this whole question. You see, because women have not been allowed, really, partly by really almost explicit sex discrimination, and in part by just sort of taken for granted attitudes that are obsolete, that deny them chance or opportunity or even aspiration to move in society. Women have not been really allowed or encouraged to use their full energies and abilities in society and to have any sense of, power, although I use that potency, perhaps would be a better word, in society. So they have almost been forced to have too much power in the home, and I think that's bad. You know, it's sort of almost a curse. It's nothing that makes women happy, and it's not good for the family, for the home to be so characterized as woman's world, for women to have to exercise all that energy in that narrow confines of the home and the family, and men to bear the full burden of the rat race, and then come home and tired from this terrible competitive rat race, and then have to somehow bear also the burdens and the guilts and the torments of the woman's lack of participation in adult life, because rat race as the outside world may be, at least, you know, it's where the action is, it's human society. And except for those few years when there are people under 3 feet tall hanging around, you know, at home, and even those people under 3 feet tall get out as soon as they can, and unless they're, you know, dragged back to take naps and things like that, you know. The woman is there alone with just these whirring machines, and pretty soon it begins to be like the question of philosophy 1:1, if the tree fell on the forest and there was no one there to hear, did the tree make a sound, did the tree exist or not? And this is the way that woman begins to feel. And no matter how the television commercials or the popular wisdom would say to her, oh, you are doing a blessed thing, you know, living for your husband and your children, and you should have an orgasm using the vacuum cleaner and wear eye makeup, you know, and it'll be glamorous. She is not participating in human adult society, and she knows it, you see. And then at least there is something real with the children, but she can then even begin to resent them, and then when they move out, she tries to hold on to them too long, and that's no good either, you see. I mean, so it's only a question of not a value thing. You can say that motherhood is a very great thing in any woman's life if she freely chooses to be a mother, and as long as she is a mother, but it can only be a minor temporal part of any woman's life now when she has 75 years.
Well, Mrs. Friedan, you describe a kind of situation which no doubt exists. What percentage of American homes or what percentage of English homes are characterized by women who suffocate from these frustrations? I don't know, perhaps you don't know, but has it occurred to you that probably for everything that you enumerate that is there to harass and to make life a drag for a woman, as much could be said about many of the activities of men.
Oh, yes.
For instance, the man who goes out, let's say, and works in an assembly line, leads a life which, a study of which by sociologists and psychologists has said leads to extraordinary frustrations. Now, it's impossible.
Absolutely, I agree with you completely.
Even for us to devise a life which is without frustration. But the fact that the general motors is of the real world, but a house, a home is not, seems to me to be an arbitrary assignment of stereotypes.
No, it isn't that, you see. Both are the real world, but let us look at them as they really are. It is a fact that assembly line work is so alienating, you know, and so lacking of human thought, that everybody knows there's something wrong with that, and in fact our whole thrust is to give men and women, you see, I would say, the education and the opportunity to choose work activities that will somehow fulfill and use their human abilities. And we must welcome, for instance, the technology that is enabling much of that dehumanizing work in the assembly line to be taken over by automation, and will free and liberate human beings for the more human use of themselves. But we know this, and therefore the young men as they grow up are, if they are not too deprived, and we are trying to work on these deprivations of economic origin or racial discrimination, all the rest, we want them to have, you know, what at least is the best in our American ethos of the individual opportunity to fulfill the individual self. We want this for women too, and it isn't that you're going to take women out of the home. The home is what women and men and children come home to for, you know, for rest, for love, for affection, for support, for very many things. And I think this remains and it may become a different kind of home, and maybe we are asking too much even out of the isolated home of the nuclear family of today, when it isn't the big extended family like you know, perhaps were one of the last to grow up in, and so on and so forth. But and yet for women to be somehow be kidded by what I call the feminine mystique, to look for more life there, that when there can be there, when in fact the man and the children are out of that home for most of the hours of their day, then she must be out in the world too, no matter wherever her ability takes her or can be used.
This is an interesting point. Are you saying that women who are happy exclusively as mothers and housewives oughtn't to be?
No,
or
not
that
at
there ought to
all.
be opportunities for those who aren't?
You see, that's been the...
Because that is an important distinction. If you're saying, in effect, mothers of the world unite because you should recognize that you are unhappy,
No,
then that is telling... some people are sort of saying
that's
that.
a non-sort of question. Look, one of the major items of the unfinished business of women's equality is that there should be an economic value put on the work women do at the home, at least recognized in Social Security, and just as so that a woman would take her Social Security just as she does from one job to another, if she chooses to stay home for those very few years when her children are little, then she shouldn't be utterly penalized for doing so the way she is now. And I think that there should be pensions for housewives, paid vacations for housewives. They shouldn't be completely dependent on their husbands. That all this should be recognized. But at the same instance, I think women should have a free human choice, not to say withdraw completely from adult society for 10 or 15 years just because they choose to have children. And that, incidentally, I think must become a free human choice, that no woman should be forced to have a child against her will. And I think, for instance, that some of the questions that you raise are almost non-questions, or peripheral, compared to really the gut issues facing our movement now, where we're in a really existential moment. I mean, on abortion, for instance, I really would like to talk about that.
Sure,
because
go ahead,
I feel that we are really at a crucial moment here. After 100 years, and really as a result of the demand of women, I mean, and because women, for up until just a few years ago, I think that this whole question of abortion, of women's body, of women's reproductive process, had been decided only by men, and that's obscene. That the vital question of women's body, whether it's be decided only by men, whether these men be politicians or priests or husbands or hospital committees, or even reformers, and then women's voice was heard, and we said it must be put in completely different terms.
That's not true.
What?
That's not true, because there's no evidence at all to suppose that the movement for abortions is primarily a women's movement.
No, but
it
now...
It doesn't matter who made the decisions. The question is what the decisions are.
All right, but now...
You might as well say that, after all, babies were never consulted about rules regarding babies.
Yes, I know, but I think that it must, in terms of what we believe in, just human dignity in America, that if constitutions had been written by women as well as men, it would be the inalienable human right of every woman to control her own body and her own reproductive process.
No, but the woman's body, as I understand it, at least this has been a point of view that has been accepted by women over the years, at least in many countries, the women's body after conception becomes simply a carrier of something which is entitled to innate consideration.
No, Bill, I can't accept. I mean, I don't think that I can't believe that even you believe this. I mean,
of course I believe it.
But don't you believe that in the primary human dignity of any individual? And a woman is a person. A woman is a human being.
Yes, but the question
a woman is not and should not be subservient to anyone else in her definition.
No, the question is whether the difference between intra and extrauterine fetuses makes so much of a difference that you give, in effect, the powers of infanticide to a woman. But in any case, this I flatly deny, that women identify in favor of abortion while men are against abortion.
I'm sorry. I think that women do. I think that everyone from Governor Rockefeller down credited the passage of the new abortion law, which has only been in effect since July, and which makes it a matter of the private conscience and free choice of the woman with her physician to, if she does not choose to have a child for any reason, to seek medical help and get medical help in a determination, through the the 6 months of pregnancy, and this is a milestone, and the law has just begun to work.
The principal
and now
polemicists for abortion have been men.
Not in this new era when we redefine the question in terms of repeal, and not just some kind of tinkering token reform that would still leave the question in other hands. But you see, we now have this law, and this law, while it is not perfect, has so reduced the deaths of women from butchering abortions. You see, it isn't a question of whether or not women are going to get abortions. They are getting them, because but only the poor women who can't have the economic resource to go to Puerto Rico or Japan or pay $1,000 for it, they were at the mercy of butchers. And the deaths by aseptic abortions that were done by the butchers have been cut by more than half in the 4 months that this law has been in effect in New York. And now we have suddenly this tremendous reactionary move to, before this law has a fair chance, and this law is being watched all over the world and all over the country because it is the great hope that it will show how we can make a more humane situation here for women. Now there are suddenly this so-called crusade for life, and the dictate that was handed down by Cardinal Cook that threatened excommunication. And I mean, I think that it is the right of the religious conscience of every human being to determine their own affairs, but not to determine the affairs of others. And when we say that it should be the right of every woman to, if she does not wish to have a child for any reason, to get medical help, then if her conscience says to her this would be wrong, then she doesn't have to. But let the other women, and especially the poor women, you see, have this right, and don't be hypocritical about it, because if you say crusade for life, I mean, the life of the woman, those deaths that have been cut in half by women who had a coat hanger butchery kind of abortion. I mean, that's what this law does. The rich, it's not a matter that they will get the abortions anyway, whatever their religion. But it's a question of every woman that's involved here.
It seems to be interesting that you should have appropriated this as a woman's issue, because it seems to me that there are two positions that you haven't, at least not yet, canvassed. One is that a child belongs not only to the woman but also to the man who is responsible for its conception. A second is that there is such a thing as a recognition of a third party right there. For instance, if you say it is purely a matter of the conscience of the woman, why wouldn't it be if the conscience of the woman...
Or the decision to choice.
Yeah. If the conscience of the woman, let's say, impelled her to get rid of her senile mother on the grounds that she was an economic burden, we wouldn't consider that the conscience would be sufficient, correct?
No,
to grant that license.
But this is, you are discussing, here, murder. You are discussing, an adult woman. When
Okay,
you are, look. I don't want to get into the argument, because
Well,
neither theologians nor doctors seem in agreement about at what point. You see, I could say the Crusade for Life would say that all of the millions and zillions of semen that never fertilize an egg, is that should someone be penalized for that? We have enormously greater powers of fertility and reproductivity, men and women, then we have the human right to use, in this society. And in fact, we don't, choose to. We have a whole human responsibility to the kind of society we're going to build, and to bringing into the world only those children that we can really take the responsibility to bring up. I was just reading some figures today that showed that a third of the children born out of wedlock are in this city are born to women in poverty, women on welfare, and women who have the first child under 18. Now, surely this is not, this out of wedlock, are the fathers who conceived these, who fertilized, these children? Are these fathers threatened with death or murder or castration because they have done this?
What should they be?
No, but neither should the
Well,
woman be threatened with a risk of life, which in effect is a risk of murder for the woman.
Now,
if you're going to subject to her to the hands of a butcher by not making abortion legal and available at city hospitals.
It may be a risk of life if she proceeds to go to a crack abortion is presumably not much of a risk of life if she proceeds to have the child.
But
then,
there is
laws
even
hold men
there.
responsible
Even there.
responsible economically for natural children?
But you see, it's a
If
woman
you
that is
can
considered.
identify.
I might feel that since it takes two to bring a child into the world, that unlike today's mores, which gives that sole responsibility really for rearing the child to the mother, that it should be shared by the woman and the man, whether in wedlock or out of wedlock. I might feel that way, and we all might believe that way, but that isn't the way it is today. So the mother is then given the sole responsibility of caring, if say it's an out of wedlock situation, of caring for bringing up this child,
but
and
that
if it's
isn't
wedlock,
true.
she's still.
That isn't true if the man is identified, as I understand it, under the law.
Well,
I remember
you know
the first,
very well that mostly they
the
aren't.
first committee I ever belonged to was called the American Boys Club for the Defense of Errol Flynn, the ABCDEF. As I remember, if he had lost that suit, or maybe he did lose it, it would mean that he had to actually look after the expenses of his natural child. So therefore, if that was the law in California in 1943,
but let's be
there must be
realistic.
an equivalent in New York.
You know, the rarefied circles of Errol Flynn are not the circles in which most Americans live. And most American women who face the question of abortion, most of them, incidentally, happen to be married women who, for whatever reasons of just resource, you know, spiritual, human, economic, psychological, don't want to have more children. But whatever their reasons, whatever their state, most American women wouldn't say, who have children out of wedlock. I told you that they are women in poverty for the most part. They don't have the resources to get a lawyer and chase an Errol Flynn. And then the question would also be whether the Errol Flynn, you know.
Well, in the cases you mentioned, they don't need an Errol Flynn because they're married to him.
Yes, but this is, but a great many are not. And as I say, the majority of women who seek abortions are married women who simply cannot afford, for any number of reasons, or do not choose or wish to have more children. But there are also a great number who are unmarried, or where there will not be a father for the child, where the child is not wanted. And there is nothing worse for children than to be brought into the world by parent or parents that don't want them. I mean, you know, when we speak of, you know, there are human responsibilities here that go beyond a kind of abstract, literal thing, you know, for the...
Yeah, you're getting, I think, into a field that is slightly removed from women's rights. I'm delighted to discuss it with you because I think you're provocative discussing it as everything else.
But I just want...
But I do think it would be very hard to find anybody who was brought up by unloving parents who, for that reason, would say he wished he hadn't been born. They say that when they get into sort of poetic raptures.
Right, but these are sort of...
By and large, they're not grateful for the chance to live or to...
They might not, I don't know, to say that you
that may
should
be a
not
biological
born.
urge. But let's just leave it this way, that it is an extra personal consideration of whether a fetus deserves some kind of protection.
Well, I mean, with all due respect to you friends of the fetus, you know, I mean, I think that the woman, I mean, I simply must insist that the very idea that the unborn fetus could have prior consideration to the living adult woman
We've got much more at stake.
implies that a woman is not, in your sense, a full human being, a soul, a person in her own right.
It's not sovereign. It's not sovereign.
Right, and I think that here we, you know, we really part company, and that this is the basic and fundamental and final freedom of women, and that to really affirm the full human dignity of women.
Well,
she is not defined as subservient or in terms, first of all, of a relationship to man or child or anyone else. Like every other human being, she must be first in terms of herself.
Ms. Friedan, in the first place, the imposition on the woman lasts 9 months, because if she wants to, at the end of 9 months, she can actually simply give the child away to a foundling home or whatever. So therefore, whereas the imposition is for 9 months on the mother, it is a terminal imposition on the fetus.
Yes,
if in fact it is aborted.
I come back to these figures that show, again, I want to confront the reality of it, The reality of it is that women are getting abortions, and rich women are getting them, even though up till previously when they had been illegal. It was poor women that were subjected primarily to the butcheries, and they often died. They died, don't you see? And the deaths from septic abortion have been cut in half by the law.
Not that many died. Not that many died, because abortions are not that expensive on the free market, as you know.
I think you are speaking from
economic.
No.
You can get in New York City. You could get an abortion from somebody competent to administer one for $300. Now, I'm not saying $300 isn't a considerable sum of money. It is, but it is not a sum that is beyond the reach of most women who live in New York City.
Well, in any event, you know, Bill, I think that we must say that this law has cut the deaths in half. This law is giving finally a more humane and real consideration to women's choice. And it's a betrayal of women to treat them with such political footballs, with such contempt, that you can say, all right, to these politicians in the state legislature, we will mess around with this law because of this reactionary crusade. We will either repeal the law outright, or we will add all this red tape about 12 weeks or in hospital or that sort of thing. And so let a few women die. And that's terrible to women. And I say to the women watching this program, let's express our outrage. You know, I'm going to give a commercial. Express our outrage to our state senators and legislators and say, you keep this abortion law that we haven't even had a year to see how it's going to work, because this is a firing line for the women of the whole nation and the world.
Well, I think you've made your pitch certainly very galvanizingly. And maybe we should, or let me just leave it by simply saying that I don't consider this to be exclusively a woman's issue.
Oh, I don't either.
That the question of deaths of women is not, I think, the preponderant question, because after all, there are people, in point of fact, as you probably know, on abortion is under proper auspices is safer than childbirth. So that you might say that any woman who chooses to conceive at all is undertaking a risk of death. And this is all the men's fault.
No,
but I can see the sense in which you
But the risk, the risk, as you say, even in childbirth, even today with our,
there's a risk of death.
There is a risk of death. So that there is the risk of death to women in childbirth. So to force her to bear an unwanted child against her will is to force her to risk her life. Do you see?
Yeah.
And I mean, there is something, this is so against our whole sense of the basic freedoms of the individual as protected in America by our Constitution, that it is only because women were not considered people that this would have been tolerated up till now. And this is why this is indeed a very germane issue to the burgeoning women's movement, which does say, yes, we are people. Women are people, and we are subservient to no one in our definition of ourselves as people.
But the trouble is, in a society, you do accept the responsibility for other people's, whether named or unnamed, rights. For example, all right, let's say you get a telephone call. Your child has just thrown up. You get into the car, and you start to go 90 miles an hour to rescue your child. Zoom, somebody comes up and says, you can't go 90 miles an hour. You got to go only 60 miles an hour because that's the speed limit. And you explain, they said there are no excuses. Now, in point of fact, that law may have been responsible for what might turn out to be the death of your child, but it is nevertheless a law that is conceived in terms of the general, impartially distributed rights of other people. And the anti-abortion tradition, which incidentally came out of not a Catholic culture, but a Protestant culture, and something about which the Orthodox Jews, as you know, have felt very strongly for religious reasons, came as a result of a recognition that there was something mysterious that was owed a certain amount of reverence, that was an intrauterine fetus, and that it deserved certain rights. Now, whether they have been totally elaborated or not, I don't know.
But
it
the reverence
as
for
simple
life,
as you say.
The reverence for life, I share, and the reverence for this mysterious thing, called humanity, and the whole evolution of it. But I think, supposing that a uterus was implanted in you, and, therefore you had to consider this in terms of an issue that was real for you, not just an abstract issue for someone else. I doubt that suddenly you would, just as surely you don't consider yourself less important than all the sperm that might fertilize eggs that don't fertilize eggs, so you couldn't consider yourself as a person, less important than an unborn fetus if,
No, I would recognize that I had certain physical power over it, in the same way that I might find that I have a certain physical power, let's say, over a senile father or mother. The question really is, do I have to defer to a set of principles which is quite honorably enacted rather than to my own desires in order to make a, generally speaking, more humanitarian
Well, but I would say
situation?
that set of principles, quite honorably enacted, still does have done up until, say now, great dishonor to those people who happen to be women and those people who happen to, give birth to the child through their bodies and have been up until now saddled with the responsibility for bringing up the child.
Well, but
that
also
a truly honorable set of such principles would give the woman this right, at least, to the control of her own body, and we have recognized that finally
the victim,
in this law in New York.
The victim is not exclusively the woman, because assuming that the woman does in fact bear the child, it has become traditionally the primary economic responsibility of the father, who may labor to pay the bills of that child for 20, 21 years.
And in fact, you will find many men.
There's a partial distribution of burden.
No, and for instance, in many instances, the married couple, it is both the man and the woman that feel they can't have more children. You see, and you find many men very strong on the need to make abortion available under honorable circumstances, and they do this not just in deference to women, but because of the whole principle of the thing, and even in terms of larger questions having to do with the future of society and the whole ecological crisis, and the fact that we must begin in human responsibility to curb our fertility if we are going to have a planet decent to inhabit and air to breathe,
Oh, well, Ms. Friedan, let me ask you this. Leaving the subject of abortion to gestate, what programmatically do you call on your followers to do? Do you want us to pass your amendment, your constitutional amendment?
Ah, well, and it's not me calling on my followers. This movement isn't that way. It is what I think women are, really vocally demanding now. I think that it's really outrageous, the Equal Rights Amendment, to the Constitution, that has been just bottled up and treated with the most cavalier contempt by Congress and the Senate for
Cavalier is an exquisitely chosen word.
For nearly 50 years, like roses on Mother's Day, but women are not, until we get this Equal Rights Amendment, women are not considered people entitled to the equal protection of the Constitution and its amendment.
Well, that's not
like
really
all
true, is it? I mean,
it is true, Bill.
We have an amendment that's 100 years old that says that people can't be deprived irrespective of race, color, or creed.
Yeah, but it doesn't say sex, see? And that's what the Equal Rights Amendment would do. It would say equality of rights under the law cannot be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
Well, women are citizens.
Yes, but it has been ruled, and as recently as the 1960s, by courts up to and including the Supreme Court, that women are not people in the sense of the Constitution, and that they can be deprived of their rights, that sex discrimination is okay. Sex discrimination is the only kind of discrimination that is still considered legal, moral, constitutional, and, if not a joke, in this country, although we are fast making it be taken seriously. So I think we are really insisting that this, in fact, on August 26th, when so many millions of us, took to the streets on the unfinished business of our equality, 50 years after women had the vote, that as a sop to us then, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, but the Senate very cavalierly and contemptuously again messed it up with some so-called protective amendments. Discrimination against women now masks in the form of protectiveness, chivalry, up from that pedestal, is what we say. But they treated it contemptuously. We are now insisting that it be passed. We are also, the other really urgent priority is child care centers, because the fact is women do work. women need to continue their education, their professional education, which in some instances coincide with childbearing years. And in order for children to be well cared for some hours of the day, if their mothers need or wish to work or continue their study, and in fact we would say if their mothers or fathers, because we feel that if you choose to bring children into the world, it should now be considered the equal responsibility in all sense of both the woman and the man.
Why do you need legislation to do that? Why don't you do it yourselves?
No, child care. You see, if you have to work, and many women have to or wish to work or continue their education, and they do have children, then there must be a good facility for, like a good nursery school for the children for certain hours a day. And countries much less rich than we, like Sweden, just take this for granted, and they provide these. And even for the children, you see, in the isolated suburban home or city apartment, whether it's expensive high-rise or a ghetto slum today, there is not enough stimulation to growth, even for the children, in the apron strings of the mother alone, you know, and so that we know that nursery schools are good for children, and that Operation Head Start was good for children, and that child care centers, you know, which would give children under trained sort of nursery school teachers stimulating growth experiences for a few hours every day, and not make the mothers forcibly to bow out of adult society or else resort to bad solutions for care of their children if they choose or need to work. Well, these are our, I would say, our primary gut issues, and then really pressing through to mop up the unfinished business of sex discrimination in education and employment, and to confront the new mores that are going to be necessary if we're going to have real equality in marriage and in the family, and even a new kind of architecture is involved. And finally, politically, we must begin to have our own voice. There must be many, many, many more women than one running for the Senate in '72, and we will have our own caucus for the Democratic Convention and the Republican Convention, and we will insist on political priorities for our issues, and we will cross party lines, if need be, to elect women to Congress, to City Hall, to state legislature, to the Senate, to 72. And this is going to happen all over the world, too. And in a year, I'm going to join with others in calling a world strike of women for equality.
Now,
Tomorrow, the world.
Don't look so censoriously at me, because the only time I ever ran for political office, I had a woman running for president of city council, and that's my running mate.
Oh, well, that's good.
But you wouldn't go so far as to say that we should pass a constitutional amendment saying that 50% of the senators had to be women, would you?
Well, no, I don't know whether I mean, I'm not a good enough lawyer to know whether that should be a constitutional amendment, but it wouldn't hurt. Wouldn't hurt. Why not?
Why not, indeed? Well, let's turn to the ladies of the panel. Miss Williams.
I'd like to do a little consciousness raising with you, Mr. Buckley. As you know, I got married several months back, and I decided to keep my own name. One of the first questions that I ran into was whether I was going to be Miss Lynn Williams or Mrs. Lynn Williams. What did I do with what was out front? For example, I thought that I should let my insurance company know that there was a change in my marital status, and I wrote off to them, and I said I would like to be Mrs. Lynn Williams. And after an exchange of about 3 letters to make them really understand my exact situation, they finally wrote back and told me that they would make no change whatsoever in the policy because the legal complications of ever collecting on it and having to explain that kind of thing would probably be more than the cost of than the money that anybody would get from the policy. We've kept my name here on the show too as Lynn Williams, and I wonder why it is we wind up calling me Miss, and what it really means that we have this whole difficulty of whether it should be Miss or Mrs. We could call me Madam, except it says something about the way women are treated.
MS, like MR.
Right.
Ms.
Except that Ms is so hard to pronounce.
I would, of course, call you anything you like. The only time we faced this problem explicitly on this program was with Cassius Clay, who wanted to call, Muhammad Ali. And that takes a little getting used to. You can't just start calling somebody Mr. Ali with that sort of practice. And Miss Millette, who is the author of Sexual Politics, I'm told won't come on this program unless I refer to as Kate, which I find, once again, sort of decomposing, psychologically decomposing. I call some of my best friends on this program Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, whatever, simply because I tend to feel that it observes a formality, which is an act of respect to the audience. But as I say, I'll call you anything you like. I think notoriously the practice has been for people who also have professional lives to call themselves Miss So-and-so. We called Miss Rosalind Turek here Miss. She's been married 4 times.
Well, but why is that? Why do we wind up preferring the Miss? I mean, why?
As I gather that the Miss...
There's something more serious about that?
The Miss, in effect, says to your own constituency, whether it's professional or artistic, that they want very much to stress the fact of your being different from merely the connubial choice of your husband. Isn't
that's
that
an
the
interesting
That is very
statement that Mr. Buckley just made. but you see, to follow the consciousness raising through a bit, you see, but you are called Mr. Buckley from unless someone knows you well enough to call you Bill, from the age of 18 or whatever on, or whenever you assume, choose to assert, this, and you are called that. Whether you in reference to your as a householder or your domestic life or your professional life.
It's purely cultural.
The same should be true of a woman. She should carry her own identity into her marriage and into her professional life, and only as the connubial. That's an awfully interesting.
But that's purely cultural, because in the home of machismo, which is called Latin America, you take your mother's name. Not your
yes,
husband,
I know some
not
Mexicans were pointing that out to me, but I don't know what that all means. But I think you see that if we said simply that every adult woman, at the age of 18 or whatever we say, would be called MS, which some of us have begun to think of as the equivalent, like as every adult man is MR, and that this would be true whether she in fact is married, unmarried, single, widowed, divorced, you see. And then perhaps, I go a step further, let them have a choice at least, that then if a woman and man marry, they might hyphenate it, each take each other's names. Like you see, if Mary Jones marries Bill Smith, then she is Mary Jones Smith and he is Bill Jones Smith.
Which is exactly the way it works in the Spanish-speaking world. Miss Bronson.
You mentioned that one of the aims, or one of the achievements of Women's Lib, is that there should be a radical restructure of society. And you mention the family, theology, politics, and art.
And employment, of course.
I'm going to take you up on art. I wonder how that can have any sort of sexual connotation.
Well, because you see, I think that women, we will not really know what women are capable of, and we will not know what the creativity of women might be. We don't know it today, because all women are in some way scarred by the denigration that no woman can really escape if she grows up as a woman in this country or in this society. Whether she, even if she does not think that she has faced, overt sex discrimination, even if she has never competed for a job, even the very fact that she has never thought, say, to compete for a job, means that she has not learned certain things about herself. She hasn't acquired the confidence that could enable her to spell her own name, and all of the things that we are taught that we are even we are socialized in early dating behavior to turn our aggression against ourselves, to somehow put on a false mask to be what we are not. To wear the simpery, twittery thing to hide our brains. All of these things that women do affect their sense of themselves that's essential for creativity. So we will not know, what women might be creatively until we get rid of sex discrimination.
I think women have been encouraged. Politician, no, doctor, lawyer, this is a man's field, but not in the arts.
No, I found some surprising census statistics that there's been an enormous increase in the number of Americans that write artist on the census blank. But that increase is almost completely men. There has been no such increase in women. And this is because women, frankly, as a result of the total sexism of this country, of the feminine mystique of sex discrimination, women are not brought up to take themselves seriously enough to be serious artists. This is where it's at, you see. And so that we don't really know what women might be. As I said, only an exceptional few women that have ever reached the point that you know, to write a book, to paint a picture seriously, to do any of these things, to say a new yes, you know, to have enough guts to say the no to the conventional thing, which is necessary to say a new yes. And, you know, no one can make it as an exception. These exceptional few only prove the case, because there must be literally millions of women who have potential creativity that they have never found.
And yet I would think the percentage of women in the arts who have made it is probably higher than you're implying.
Certainly in ballet.
And ballet, and women writers now. Look at the women's editors of magazines.
Yes, and yet
Yeah,
even,
you know.
even here you find, up until very recently, there was nothing considered a bit wrong. That all that say leading women's magazines would be completely edited by men, you know, and they would say they, and they would talk down to they, you know, who are considered, you know, not much. It never went beyond 5th grade, and with all due respect to your medium, Mr. Buckley, television assumes an IQ of, you know, minus 80 on the part of every woman who's, you know, it assumes that she's really a moron, whose greatest thrill is to get the kitchen sink pure white, and who needs the counsel of elderly male and all the help of modern science to do that, you know. And all your commercials assume that woman in her natural, unadorned state is so repulsive, you see, so sexually inadequate. She's nothing without a man. She has to do buy millions of dollars worth of things to catch, trap, or keep a man in her natural state. She's just disgusting. She smells, you know. She's nothing, you know.
Mrs. Greenfield.
Many men think that women's liberation really means a sexual revolution, a revolution they feel threatened by. Is this a bedroom revolution? Have men anything to fear?
I think men have only things to hope for and wish would happen more quickly. It is a sexual revolution in the most basic sense, because if you really, but it is not a bedroom war. I think what happens in the bedroom is inevitably affected by the total relationship between man and woman, and there's a lot of hostility between men and women today that's unnecessary. I don't think the war between the sexes is necessary. I think that the inequity that oppresses men almost as much as women forces this hostility and corrupts and dehumanizes what goes on in the bedroom. The sexual revolution, as it's headlined today, is really almost a dirty joke, whether we're talking about pornography or anti-pornography. It's dehumanized sex, and it's often eroticized rage. We will have a real sexual revolution. Men and women will be free to make love, not war, when we get on with this real business of equality.
Well, there is no legislation affecting that aspect of what we're talking about that you have in mind, is there?
That goes beyond legislation.
It would simply issue out of a rearrangement of essential relationships.
No, but even matters like child care centers, even matters like getting rid of sex discrimination in Social Security, even matters like re-looking at our educational system and seeing how it fosters the self-denigration of women and the idea of the definition of roles of men and women. All of these will change the total relationship between men and women, and that will inevitably make the sex more human.
Thank you, Ms. Friedan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, ladies of the panel.